And then every time someone who's unfamiliar with the area comes into town, it gives all the locals an excuse to spin a yarn. I mean, if you were a guy who had never been out west, and you know, this is pre-internet or widespread education, and you saw a jackrabbit mount with antlers and everyone in town told you it's real, I mean, who are you to not believe that? Now, when they get to all of the stories about it can only breed during lightning strikes or whatnot, that's different. But it became a fun story that a bunch of people would add their own legends to. And like I said, in Wyoming, it was a joke for a while that you could get a license to hunt a jackalope, but it would have a stipulation like, can only be on February the 30th, or can only take place in the minute before and after midnight. So while sure, there's not a lot to the legend of the creature itself, it's the legends and cultures that were built around it that make it so special, and what makes me put it at B tier. I also just noticed that I left my ceiling light on, which has been reflecting on the board this whole time. You think 3 million subs can't figure out how lights work. Next up, we have the Jersey Devil. The Jersey Devil, also known as the Leeds Devil, is a monster said to stalk the pine barrens of southern New Jersey. Descriptions vary, but in every variation, the devil is a combination of different animal features. It is often cited as a sort of dragon, with bat-like wings, goat-like hooves, and the head of a horse. While the natives' legends of a flying creature within the Pine Barrens predate colonial legend, the story of the Leeds Devil is far more popular. According to legend, in the 1730s, a woman named Mrs. Leeds discovered that she was pregnant with her 13th child. Understandably, Mother Leeds was upset and cursed the unborn child. When the child was born, it transformed into the Jersey Devil and flew out of the house, stalking those who stray from the trails of New Jersey ever since. The Jersey Devil's a fascinating one. Unlike a lot of cryptids, it has a definitive origin story, and while the characterization of other cryptids is often kind of ambiguous, the Jersey Devil is expressly evil. It's a creature born from hell that will kill or haunt anyone who gets in its way. It's also particularly terrifying, and one of the only cryptids that I can definitively say scared me to death as a child. It's scary, it's cool, and it looks weird, so I'm putting it at A tier. And the last cryptid for tier 1 is the Dogman. The Dogman, also known as the Michigan Dogman, rose to infamy in 1987 when a disc jockey named Steve Cook released a song called The Legend, detailing the story behind the creature. According to the legend, the Dogman was first seen in 1887 in Wexford County, Michigan. The creature has the body of a man with the head of a dog. While many associate this appearance with the commonly known werewolf, stories of the Dogman imply a less blended, more distinct appearance of a canine's head on a man's body. While stories of attacks are scarce, the haunting appearance is enough to drive many locals to a place of fear. The Dogman's an interesting one. Things like the werewolf have been so overplayed in pop culture that few people still find the idea of one scary, but there is something directly uncanny about just a man's form with a dog's head. And while that in itself is cool, the Dogman kind of has a shaky beginning, so to speak. Like, a lot of these cryptids and stuff come from local legend or stories or sightings or what have you. But the Dogman began with a disc jockey making a song about him, and then sightings of the creature began. And while I'm not going through this whole thing talking about why cryptids are fake or why this one is less likely to exist than the other one, because that's pretty lame. I mean, the Dogman was just a guy wrote a song about it and people started singing it, so kind of lessens the cool factor a little bit. So that, coupled with the creature's design being pretty basic, brings it down a bit for me. A lot of the stories that have come off of the legend are pretty cool, so I'm putting it at C tier. And now, let's do a quick run through of the other non-applicables from tier 1. Classic Animals of Discovery was the book that Lewis and Clark put together of all the animals they discovered on their voyage out west. This is fascinating because for the first time in written literature, there were hundreds of newly documented animals. It goes to show how quickly something can go from unknown to cataloged in the matter of a single trip. Sea serpent, similar to the Kraken, is a legend that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. But everything that I would have said about the sea serpent, I pretty much mentioned with the Kraken stuff. And since the two overlap so much, I'm leaving it down here since it in itself is kind of vague. Lauren Coleman is the founder of the International Cryptozoology Museum that I mentioned earlier, and he's also foundational in a ton of cryptid legends. Like some of the stuff we're going to be talking about later on was named by the guy.
A trailer. Hold on. Destiny 2. This is what they just launched today?
A wish to pursue the witness.
No, I think I just saw that. Light Darkness Saga. No, we won't watch this. I just saw this on my phone. That armor set does look nice. I'm gonna have to log in. Oh, that looks like it's gonna be as what's it called? The Witcher. That kinda sucks. That's all gonna be in nebulous. The emote's kinda dope. The artwork is good. I like the artwork. Titan kinda got the worst design, but everything else looks good. Alright, anyways, we'll go back to One Lagoon. No, we don't care.
Hello everybody! Today I'm 33 when several locals reported seeing the creature both in and out of water. This series of local stories culminated in 1934 when the famed surgeon's photograph was taken. Despite most legends, consistencies across all of the stories and legends around it, the explanation. Descriptions vary A tier. And the last creature's design being pretty basic brings it down a bit for me. A lot of the stories that have come off of the legend are pretty cool, so I'm putting it at C tier. And now, let's do a quick run through of the other non-applicables from tier 1. Classic Animals of Discovery was the book that Lewis and Clark put together of all the animals they discovered on their voyage out west. This is fascinating because for the first time in written literature, there were hundreds of newly documented animals. It goes to show how quickly something can go from unknown to cataloged in the matter of a single trip. Sea serpent, similar to the Kraken, is a legend that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years, but everything that I would have said about the sea serpent, I pretty much mentioned Kraken stuff. Since the two overlap so much, I'm leaving it down here since it in itself is kind of vague. Lauren Coleman is the founder of the International Cryptozoology Museum that I mentioned earlier, and he's also foundational in a ton of cryptid legends. Like some of the stuff we're going to be talking about later on was named by the guy, and he's done more for the cryptid community than probably anyone else alive. You'll be hearing more about him later on in the series. The Fiji mermaid is the original cryptid hoax. People took the torso of a monkey and stitched it to the tail of a fish and told people that they had found mermaids. Josh Gates, the host of the show Destination Truth, goes into cryptid sightings and exploring cryptid encounters. The coelacanth is a species of fish that was believed to be extinct for tens of millions of years until they were found alive in the 1930s off the southern coast of Africa. An example of how things we believe could have been extinct for times long before us can simply pop up and rewrite our understanding of biology.
Shut up.
A common occurrence you're going to see throughout a lot of the possibly extinct species
This ain't no anime. Shut up.
Expedition Everest was the Disney World attraction that featured the Yeti and helped popularize the Yeti culture. And finally, the TV show Finding Bigfoot. TV show where they set out to find Bigfoot. Found him, although the show itself is very funny. There were a couple more terms on Tier 1, like the Patterson-Gimlin film that I mentioned with Bigfoot, or the surgeon's photograph that I mentioned with the Loch Ness Monster, but I already talked about those, so they don't need to go up here. And with that, we have the end
Bro, you
of
a
Tier
bitch
1.
ass nigga,
If
like,
you're
you
familiar
got
with
no
cryptozoology to
You
any
a bitch
degree,
ass nigga, shut
then
the fuck
you've
up. That's why
probably
you're
already
bitch
heard
ass
this
nigga.
advantage.
Bitch ass nigga.
But this serves as an
That's why you
excellent
already had an
introduction to the
advantage,
series.
boy.
We've talked about a lot of the common ones, what their
It's an
cultural
advantage and a
impact is,
disadvantage, so
and
shut
you
the
all
fuck up.
have a feel for how the rest of the series will go. So I am going to get started on editing this and then immediately get into research for the second video, which will hopefully be up in a matter of days after this one comes out. Because from here, we just have a whole lot of weird. We've dipped our toes into the shallows, and join me in the
Shots
following
illegal.
episodes of the series as we dive into the deep end. But for now, for those of you who have stuck around this long in the video, was a gas tank that, if a valve was turned, would provide heating to the entire trailer. However, it seems that this gas tank was never turned. This is just as odd, if not more odd, than the torches in the cabin never being used or a fire never being started. But again, perhaps they were just afraid of something finding them out there. Also on top of that, several of the ration cans were opened with what's called a church key can opener. It was something very popular back in the 70s. People would have used it to open soda bottles, and it's likely that all of the boys were familiar with it. But there's a mention in the reports that one of the cans was opened with a P-38 military can opener. For this reason, a lot of people say Jack Madruga had to make it to the trailer because he was in the military and would know how to use the military can opener and may have even had one on him. That doesn't make any sense because do you know who else was in the military? Gary. And if you're asking if either Jack or Gary were more likely to keep a military can opener on them, it would definitely be Gary. It's for those reasons that I think 3 of the boys died on the night of February the 24th, and why I think Ted and Gary were the only ones to survive in that trailer for potentially the next 3 months. Now that we know everything that definitively happened and my idea of what might have happened on the night of February the 24th, let's talk about the one witness who supposedly was there for the crucial moment that the 5 men left the car. And that is the testimony of a man named Joseph Schoen, whose car was stuck on the same trail that the boys' car was abandoned on. According to Joseph Schoen, he was driving up the mountain to check out a cabin that him and his family would be staying in that same weekend. February the 24th was a Friday, and on the 25th and 26th, him and his family planned to stay in a cabin at the top of Loomis National Forest, so effectively, Joseph was setting out to see how bad the snow would be for the family trip. He was driving up the mountain when, just like the 5 boys, shortly after crossing the 4,400-foot line and hitting the snow cap, his Volkswagen Beetle became stuck. Joseph gets out of the vehicle to push the car so that he can get traction and continue driving, when as he's pushing, he begins to have a heart attack. Now, Joseph had had a history of chest pains and heart issues, so whenever he felt the tightness in his chest, he knew it might be serious. As a matter of fact, the pain was so intense that he threw up and defecated right there on the side of the snow-covered road. So, not wanting to push himself until he, died, Joseph decided to sit down in his vehicle and wait for the pain to stop. Eventually, Joseph fell asleep in his vehicle until around 11:30 or midnight, he heard what sounded like someone whistling for a dog, or basically someone whistling as if they're trying to get something's attention. Joseph comes to and looks in his rearview mirror and sees that behind him, about 100 feet down the road, just over a bend, he can see the headlights of a vehicle. Joseph, seeing this as an opportunity to get help, gets out of his Beetle and walks over a short incline to see around the bend of whoever's headlights these are aiming up the road. Joseph says that he saw the 69 Mercury Montego parked right there where the police would later find it, but behind it was a rusty red pickup truck. Standing outside of both the Montego and the pickup truck were 6 or 7 people, one of which, he said, looked like a woman holding a small baby. Joseph sees these people and begins to yell for help. However, he says as soon as he starts yelling, everyone quits talking, they turn off their headlights, before it seems that everyone, or at least what seemed to be everyone in the hazy nighttime air, files into the red truck and the truck backs up and goes back down the mountain. Joseph thinks this is just a group of people who got stuck, so everyone hopped into the truck that could still get out of the snow. And thinking that they just didn't want to help him, he gets upset and walks back to his car. He says about an hour later, he's looking into the rearview mirror and sees what appears to be flashlights in the tree line, walking back and forward. Again, Joseph gets out of his car and yells for help, but as soon as he starts to yell, the flashlights cut out. At this point, Joseph's just wholly frustrated. He thinks this is another person who's stuck on the mountain and just doesn't want to help him. So Joseph sets in his car and leaves the engine running to try to maintain some heat. However, at 4 a.m., his car runs out of gas. Seeing that the only other option is freezing, Joseph gets out of his car and starts walking down the mountain. From there, some good Samaritan gives him a ride home, and after all of this investigation begins, he gives that story to the police. Now, the majority of accounts you'll read, or people who talk about this story, just take Schoen's testimony that there was a red truck there and that it interacted with the boys, and they just leave it at that. They take it as Bible. For reasons I'm going to talk about in a minute, I believe almost none of Joseph Schoen's testimony. As a matter of fact, I think Schoen might have had something to do with the boy's disappearance, and reiterating all the allegedlys and whatnot. But I think he did. Or at the very least, he knows more than he's letting on. But I'll talk about why in a minute. Shortly after the boys disappeared, the Yuba County Sheriff's Office put out a reward of $1,215 to anyone who had information that led to the boys' discovery. Because of this, they had calls from all over the country, and even outside of the country. There were reports that the boys were seen at an airport in Miami, that they were in Ontario walking into a movie theater. Basically, as soon as you mention money, people just get dollar signs in their eyes and start to say whatever comes to mind. However, aside from Joseph Schoen, which Joseph Schoen was definitely on the mountain that night, as evidenced by his stuck beetle, but aside from his testimony, all the others were tenuous. However, there are two that might hold some value. One of them was of a woman who worked at a gas station in Brownsville. Now, Brownsville is the town that the boys would have had to have taken the exit in to get going the wrong direction up the mountain to the national park. At Brownsville, there was a location known as Mary's Country Store. She said that whenever she pulled up to Mary's to start her shift, that she got out of her vehicle, and sitting in a vehicle next to her were two guys who she thought might be mentally handicapped. She said this was because they had very wide smiles. The two men waved at her and she waved back. And then as she was walking in, she saw that two other men were standing in a phone booth just in front of the store itself. After starting her shift, she said that the two guys from the phone booth came inside, bought things like chocolate milk and snack bars, before they got back in the vehicle with the two other men and drove away. The store owner even corroborated this story and said that the men came in 2 days in a row. The police showed her pictures of the boys, and she picked out every one except for Gary. Now, here's the wrench in this whole thing. According to them, this back-to-back visit to Mary's Country Store was on February the 25th and February 26th. This makes no sense because the disappearance happened on February 24th. So what? Did the boys go up the mountain, get stuck, leave the vehicle unlocked, and then everyone but Gary drive down the mountain? Keep in mind they're both missing their game and haven't contacted their families. They go to this country store, get some snacks, get back in their vehicle, and then the next day they come back and do it again. Again, all without, telling their family or doing anything that makes sense for the timeline to understand. Because that would mean after all that happened, they decide to just go abandon themselves back where the car stuck and die in the woods. Now, otherwise, I would throw this story out completely and say it's just the store owner and the employee who thought they could lie to the police and each get $600 out of it. If it wasn't for one detail of their account that I will mention later. The third and final testimony that investigators really gave any credit to was the testimony of a man named Mr. Redrick. Redrick was a fairly well-to-do guy from Yuba County who owned property up around Plumas National Forest. Redrick said that about a year before the disappearance, he had gone up to check out the property, and while he was at his cabin in the middle of the woods, Ted Weir showed up. Ted Weir, who was up here in the middle of the woods with an older man who appeared to be in his 40s or 50s, as well as what appeared to be the man's son, who was maybe 14 to 16 years old, the three of them said that they were out hunting. Now, this doesn't make any sense because Ted Weir, as we've talked about, had a fear of the woods, a fear of the dark, and according to his family, he had a fear of firearms, and he didn't like to hurt animals. So him being up here in the middle of the woods with two otherwise strangers, because when this was reported to the family, they had no idea who these people might be. Why would he be in the middle of the woods just walking around Redrick's property? Now, it's possible that Redrick might have known Ted Weir. Again, Ted would do things like bag groceries at the local store, so it's possible that Redrick had seen him before, and that's why he recognized him up in his cabin. But I wouldn't think that Redrick and Ted would be close, or he would really know who it is. So I would more than likely with this story, and again, keep in mind, there were literally hundreds of false sightings of the boys. I would say that Redrick either made a mistake in thinking it was Ted Weir, or he just wanted the $1,200. And again, I would completely write this story off as just 3 other guys who were up in the mountain who had no connection to the case, if it wasn't for one detail about his testimony that I'll talk about in a minute. Now, at this point, we have looked at all of the logistics and witnesses of the case itself. While some aspects of these testimonies are often linked over others, the consensus seems to be that the boys drove up there in the vehicle, either under force or under their own free will, before they were forced to leave the vehicle, wandered out into the woods, and succumbed to the elements. In the initial reporting of this case, the media and some police forces were unnecessarily rude about the boys' condition. A lot of people just wrote it off as, oh, they're handicapped. Well, no wonder they just decided to walk off into the woods for no reason. But as we've talked about, these guys were competent enough to do things like hold a job or drive vehicles. It doesn't make sense that they would just wind up in the situation they did. And those who research the case in the modern age, as well as the victims' families, agree with that. So, it seems to be that at some level of everything that transpired, foul play had to be involved. Either some malicious force forced them to go up the mountain, or some malicious force scared them out of the car, or kept them segregated to the top part of the mountain, too scared to come down, or perhaps all 3. And now that you have the pieces, we can get into the theories around the case. And there is one theory that is far and away more popular than all the others. It is held by, I would say, 70 or 80% of the documentaries and news reports that I have read about this case. It is believed by several of the family members of the boys who went missing, specifically like the Madruga family, and it seems to be the consensus that a lot of people go with. And that is the belief that either by accident or on purpose, the boys were killed by Gary Mathias. That either by his leadership or malicious purpose, he took the boys up to the mountain and had them either killed by the elements, or perhaps even killed them himself. The supporting information for this theory are things like Gary was the most intelligent out of the men, and if they were to do something like detour or walk out into the woods, it would either have to be his idea or at least with his consent. He did have a history of criminal violence as discussed earlier, so if there was anyone in the group more likely to commit an act of violence, it would be him. And out of the boys, he was the most likely to be the outsider. While the boys got along with him, the parents were always kind of put off by him. Again, his spacey attitude and history of violence. And of course, the fact that Gary was never found. And while, like I said, this is far and away the most popular theory, and the majority of people who talk about the case will theorize that Gary got the boys killed, one way or the other, I don't believe that Gary did it. As a matter of fact, I think he might have been their last lifeline. Even the theories that it was accidental, that Gary just decided, hey, let's drive up to the woods, it'll be a fun trip. And then from there, he just made a series of bad decisions that got everyone killed. While I think that might be more likely, I still don't think that's what happened. And to explain why, let's talk about Gary Mathias. As a young boy, Gary showed no signs of a mental illness. It wasn't until in elementary school when he suffered a serious head injury that he began to show signs that something was wrong. But of course, this was the 1960s, and standards of mental health were nothing compared to what they are today. So most people just considered young Gary to be off or have something wrong with him. Beginning in high school, it seems that Gary began to experiment with different kinds of drugs, most likely a form of self-medication. He played football in high school and seemed to be well liked by people around him, But after high school, he didn't have a lot of options. So, Gary joined the military. After being in the military for a couple of years, most likely because his drug problem seemed to worsen around this time, Gary began to act out. He began to be violent to other people around him. He began to have shouting fits and be inconsolable. It culminated when one day, after he had spent some time in the brig for getting in a fight with another soldier,
at University of Maryland Global Campus, earn up to 90 undergraduate credits for relevant experience.
A sergeant, I believe it was a sergeant, some just say officer, some high-ranking military person came to let him out, and as soon as they let him out, Gary punched him in the face. He was also naked when he did it, but the important part was he punched the guy in the face. When Gary was later asked why he did this, Gary said that he wanted to be out of the military, and he figured if he punched this guy, they'd kick him out. Gary had a psych evaluation around this time, and he was formally diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Because of this, he was discharged from the military and returned home. He thought he might attend school for a while, so he wanted to go live with his grandmother up in Portland, Oregon, but his parents, seeing that he was beginning to act out, thought that it might not be a good idea, and they urged him to come back, and eventually Gary just cut off contact with his parents. That was until one day, a very unshaven and dirty Gary Mathias showed up at his parents' doorstep when last they heard he was living with his grandmother up in Portland. Turns out that one day, for seemingly no reason at all, Gary decided to walk from Portland, Oregon to his parents' home in Yuba County. This was a distance of 550 miles that Gary traversed by walking and hitchhiking, doing things like stealing milk and dog food off of people's porches just to stay alive. So while he was unstable socially, sure, the dude had the fortitude to just pull out a map and walk from Portland to Yuba all in one trip. It was a couple years after this, once Gary had returned home, that his violent tendencies began to crop up. Gary was about 23 at the time, and I'm not going to sugarcoat it. What he did was pretty bad. There were several occasions that men would fight in local bars because he would do things like grope their wives. One time, after getting into an altercation with a man, he began to scream at the man's 3-year-old daughter and threatened to kill her. And in perhaps the most terrifying thing he ever did, a couple who was living in Yuba County awoke one night to see Gary Mathias standing in their bedroom, just cloaked in darkness. Whenever they freaked out and asked what he's doing here, he said that he was there to get a ring back from them that he needed to give to Satan, and that they're in his house and they owe him money. Because of this, Gary was constantly in and out of jail. His parents would pay his bail to get him out, and this entire time he was acting out in extreme violence. After this last instance where he broke into someone's house, his family recognized that he was getting worse and someone might really get hurt. So, seeking help, they eventually got him involved with Gateway Projects. As mentioned earlier, Gateway Projects was a program for people who had various different mental disorders or conditions. And through Gateway Projects, Gary, for the first time, properly treated his schizophrenia. And as soon as he got on medication, Gary became a model citizen. He began to take care of himself and make amends with the people that he had hurt and wronged. He had money coming in from the VA, but he also began to work with his dad and help him run his business. According to those around him, Gary became socially outgoing and began to volunteer for local work within the community. As a matter of fact, Gateway Project said that he was a model case of someone getting the help they needed and making the most of it. The way that he came into contact with the 4 others was, after a year in the program, his counselor said that Gary could really use some friends. So he introduced Gary to the 4 others of the Gateway Gators basketball team who needed a team leader. And according to counselors, coaches, and everyone around, as soon as Gary met the 4 others, they became inseparable. Gary was smart and he was able to think things out clearly, so he would often travel with the boys wherever they went to make sure they were okay. According to those who knew them, Gary was very protective of the 4 other boys and very defensive if anyone insulted or threatened them. At the time of the disappearance, Gary had a relationship with his high school sweetheart, and the two of them seemed to get along great. His life was in a fantastic condition when the disappearance happened, but that didn't change the news and reports around from just simply pulling up his criminal history and calling it an open and shut case. The news said that the 4 men who were mentally disadvantaged went up the mountain with a psychopath, a crazed schizophrenic who was ready to hurt them at a moment's notice. And aside from a couple family members who were just afraid of what happened to their boys and pointed a finger to Gary quickly, because, again, he had a history of violence, and out of all the boys, he was the one who should have known better than, you know, walking up a mountain in the middle of the night. Everyone said that Gary was a great guy who really loved his friends. And when I think about it that way, some of the details of this case absolutely break my heart. Again, going off of my theory and what I think a lot of people who know the case kind of accept as the timeline of events, Bill, Jack, and Jack all died on the way to the trailer, which means that the only two people who made it were Ted and Gary. And Ted was in no position to do anything. His toes were falling off. He certainly wasn't gathering food or wrapping himself in all those blankets. But for Ted to be alive as long as he was, someone had to be feeding him, someone had to be keeping him warm and dry, and someone, after Ted died, had to wrap what was left of him in 7 blankets that were scrounged together from that cabin. There were ration canisters all over the room where Ted's body was found. And Ted, who originally weighed about 200 pounds, it was estimated that at his time of death, he probably weighed closer to 100. And it was likely because he was battling pneumonia and wasn't in the mood to eat a lot of food. What little he did eat to keep him alive that long was probably forced on him by Gary. The only other evidence that the police stated in their report that was found in the cabin of activity were of things like candles that had been burnt and playing cards that had been used. I can't help but imagine Gary taking care of Ted as long as he could. And then after Ted dies, he wraps him in a blanket, gathers what little supplies he has, and steps out into the woods. Now, again, I am just a guy on the internet who has read what other people have witnessed and documented. My information could be wrong, and my opinions could be wrong. A lot of people who are close to the case believe that Gary was the perpetrator, or at least insistent on a lot of the things that caused events to happen. And who am I to argue with people who are there who are actually related to it? But from what I know, I don't think Gary did it. And I think it's tragic that a lot of people do. I also think a lot of events that took place can kind of be explained with Gary's fortitude to survival. Again, we know he walked 550 miles through some pretty cold temperature. So perhaps after Bill and Jack Madruga died on the path, or maybe one of them died and the other wouldn't leave them. If my theory of the path they traveled is correct, I could imagine Gary urging the 2 others to follow him, because while they might be a lost cause, he wouldn't lose anyone else. Same with after Jack Hewitt's death, Gary may have just been trying to save Ted, the last man he could save. Now, another thing to keep in mind is Gary was a good, upstanding guy while he was on his medication. As I mentioned before his medication, he had some pretty violent tendencies and harsh delusions. And this was a medication that he would take twice a day, every day. So, it is true that without that medication, there's no telling what his mindset might have switched to in the following weeks. It wouldn't have had anything to do with the initial disappearance or the first several nights on top of the mountain. But after several weeks, once the medications left his system, he might have been in a pretty bad place. Perhaps the flashlight and blankets that were found a quarter-mile away from the trailer were his. Maybe he had packed them and then in a haste discarded them for no reason. He might have just ran off wildly into the woods and then eventually succumbed to the elements as well, and his separation from the location may explain why his body was never found. Given that he would have been off his medication for some time, the local authorities searched at mental health facilities, at hospitals, at prisons, to see if there was any sign of Gary Mathias, and again, none was ever found. It is highly likely that he died in those woods as well. I just think he did it after everyone else. Gary, who had the most experience and was the most likely to survive out of all of them, I believe, kept the others alive as long as he could. So if I don't think Gary did it, then what do I think happened? And to answer that question, let's look at Joseph Schoen. So in the news reports and even some of the police interviews after the disappearance, Joseph Schoen is painted to be just an upstanding family man who had a bit of a health scare, and then he was very complicit with the police and wanted to see these boys returned home safe. And that is not at all what he was. Joseph Schoen was the town drunk and had a habit for making a fool of himself and driving drunk and running his car off the road. He was a compulsive liar, and according to those who knew him, very annoying. Because he would drive drunk so often, it was a common sight to see his Volkswagen Beetle ran off the side of a road. And initially, you know, it's a small community, people would go to help him out, but he was always hateful about it, never grateful, and just made their day worse. So eventually, it was not uncommon for his car to be left at locations for days at a time because no one wanted to talk to him. One of his family members even said that if Joseph Schoen was ever murdered, the case could never be solved because the entire town would be a suspect because everyone had a reason to kill him. Remember his whole story that the reason he was going up there in the first place was because he was going to check out a weekend cabin that he was staying at with his family? Well, it turns out that he did not own a cabin up there and did not rent a cabin up there. All of that was a lie. What more than likely was happening is earlier that day, he was seen at a bar getting drunk. So most likely he just got drunk and started driving and then slipped off on the side of the road. And he didn't want to tell the police that, so he said that he was going up there to look at a weekend cabin. His entire testimony, which I read earlier by the way, was the third iteration of his testimony, or technically fourth. So the part about him walking into the lodge 8 miles down the hill in the early morning hours of February the 25th is true. And if you'll remember, I said he got a ride home with some good Samaritans who were at the lodge. According to the 2 people who drove him home, he was ungrateful and annoying for the entire ride. He kept complaining about getting stuck and said that the reason he got stuck is because a car was tailgating him the whole way up the mountain and eventually caused him to spin off the road. Now, this is very different, again, from the story that he would eventually give the police. And it's hard to tell with a compulsive liar which one's the lie and which one is true, but there might be a sliver of truth to it, considering these were the initial things that he told the 2 people he was in the vehicle with before he thought through what he wanted to tell the police. Or at the same time, he could have just been looking for an excuse as to why he got the car stuck, because saying that he just did it on his own was too embarrassing. But either way, a very different story than his official account. After he got home, he fell asleep, and when his wife came home to see how he was doing, he explained that his car got stuck on top of the mountain, so his wife and another guy went to go get it because I guess he just couldn't be bothered. To help her move his car that he got stuck. Now, according to them, it was out of gas, which is an element of the testimony he would eventually give the police. And at the very least, the car was up there because the same park service ranger who called in the 69 Montego that the boys were in said that there was a Volkswagen stuck just in front of it. Also, fun fact, remember the detail earlier that his heart attack was so awful that he defecated outside of his vehicle? The park ranger also confirmed that he saw that there as well. I believe it was while the wife was freeing the car, she heard about the investigation. The husband called the police and gave them a very brief version initially, saying that he was up there and he saw that car and he saw some boys standing around it. So then the police call him back a couple days later to get more details. In the second phone call with the police, which is now the 3rd time that he's told this story, he said that whenever he walked and looked at the car, he saw 2 to 12 people, which... What? How is it either 2 or 12? He also said that while in his initial phone call he said there was a truck parked behind the car, that the police shouldn't worry about it because he was having a heart attack and might have been hallucinating. Which again, what? I know heart attacks can be pretty bad and all, but you just imagine a truck and 10 other people were there? His story had a lot of inconsistencies, so for the final time that he gave his testimony, the police sent someone to interview him directly. By this time, over a week had passed since the boy's disappearance, and Joseph Schoen was in the hospital. He had finally gone to the hospital over his heart attack, and the doctor confirmed that he did have a heart attack. Kinda. So you remember how I said Joseph Schoen had chest pains and like a history of heart issues? Well, this was 1978, and the doctor said that he did have a heart attack at some point. So that doesn't mean that everything that happened in his hallucinations and whatnot were because of a heart attack that he had on top of the mountain. It is much more likely that he got hammered, ran his car off the road, and then his heart attack hallucination was just his drunken stupor. That also makes more sense to why he pulled his pants down and defecated next to his car, rather than doing that because he was having, again, a heart attack. But while he was in the hospital, he gave a final testimony to investigators. This testimony he gave in the hospital is the one I read earlier. But there's some weird things to note about that testimony. For one, whenever the police got there, the investigators spoke to the nurses, and the nurses said that for the past several days, Joseph Schoen couldn't quit crying, and that he was inconsolable to anyone who tried to help him with whatever he was going through. But as soon as the police showed up, he pulled it together. Also, while the police were giving the interview, everything seemed to be going fine. Joseph was answering questions until they started to ask more questions about the specifics of the boys, where they went, what they looked like, what vehicle they seemed to get in, etc. And just midway through, Joseph stops, leans back in the hospital bed, and says, "You think I know more than I'm letting on, don't you?" Which is a really weird thing for a witness to say regarding a disappearance. Like, what a strange thing to just say unprompted. Another detail, remember how I said that in the early hours of February 25th, Joseph made his way into the lodge 8 miles down from where the cars got stuck? According to the people who saw him walking, several different witnesses said that he walked into the lodge, sat down at the bar, rubbed his head in his hands, and said, "I should have done this 2 years ago." Now, there's a lot of people who think that Joseph Schoen was directly responsible for what happened to the boys, and I don't think so. Joseph Schoen, while he was arrested several times for DUIs, and he was known to have a temper and lie to people, there was nothing to indicate that he was expressly violent, at least not to any degree that he would murder people. And some of the more damning details, like him crying the days prior and him saying the thing about 2 years ago in the lodge, I think can be excused. The whole comment about "I should have done this 2 years ago" could have been in response to anything. Who knows what he was thinking about in his several-hour walk down the mountain. He could have been talking about, you know, getting a new car because the Volkswagen was unreliable. He could have been talking about, you know, getting his heart checked out. Maybe he did have some heart pains. I'm not sure about the heart attack because I don't believe him. But maybe he was talking about he needed to go get his heart checked out 2 years ago. Who knows? Also, that line doesn't make any sense if he did murder the guys. What, 2 years ago he should have got them to come up the mountain before they even knew each other and killed them? One interesting thing of note is Schoen's daughter had dysphagia, so there's a chance that maybe she attended some of the Gateway Project's events, because the Gateway Project was pretty well known throughout the area. So because of that, it's possible that Joseph Schoen may have known one or a few of the boys. But I mean, everyone in a small town knows each other in some way. I still don't think, even if he did know him, that would mean he wanted to kill them. Some believe that perhaps Joseph Schoen caused an encounter that caused the boys to flee. Now, I think this one might be more plausible. Perhaps the boys were driving up behind Schoen, or they just also so happened to get stuck near him, and Schoen was drunk and caused a scene that scared the boys off. But for one, I don't think that, say, Gary would have been afraid of some drunk old guy who was just yelling obscenities at them. I could see that for some of the others, but I don't think Gary would have, you know, been like, all right, guess we gotta go up the hill now. And even then, worst case scenario, if he did start yelling at him or scared him off or whatever, then why not just walk back down the mountain? You know, it's not covered in snow and ice. Instead, I think what happened is Joseph Schoen saw something that he wasn't supposed to. See, Schoen had connections to a bit more extreme criminal routes than just a DUI, to grow and sell weed. They tried it twice. One time, some other people who were selling weed came and tried to steal it from him, and the second time they tried, the police seized it all. But because of this, it's likely that Joseph had connections to distributors or dealers in the area. That would